Hi, John.
Hi.
So let's keep this this going. This question of how we communicate and interact on this wonderful space that we created, and are we tolerating each other? Are we just using the space for what we wanted to do before? Do you talked about Wikipedia, but what do you think more generally? Do you think more generally we're transforming this space?
I think we're starting to. I mean, you know, I spent a lot. I know you grew up in Africa. I spent a bunch of time in Africa trying to get it connected to the internet, and somewhat successfully by myself. And you know, I wanted. Brian Eno had said something that the problem back in the late '80s. He said the problem with the internet is there's not enough Africa in it. Well, there's still not enough Africa in it in terms of the culture, but it, you know, nevertheless is getting there. And cultures, you know, and other cultures are starting to be able to manifest themselves, but it's difficult because so much of what goes on in cyberspace has to do with language.
Yeah.
Still. And so much of what is really true to a culture is in its own language. You can't, you know, you can't have a lingua franca that expresses most of the things that are unique to that culture.
So when you look at these data that show the rate of linguistic diversification on the web, do you see that as a positive or a negative thing?
Absolutely positive. I mean, there are, you know, it's now possible for marginal languages to actually have a published, so to speak, published literature of significant dimensions.
But it means we're not part of one conversation.
Yeah, it does mean that, and we're never going to be. But you know, we're still in the process, I think, of learning how to be local and global simultaneously, which first of all means, I would guess, being in the process of learning how to think two completely different ways at once. You know, which we have a difficult time doing in the West.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
which Africans are much more comfortable with.
Yeah.
Because
I mean,
they had to live that way.
Well, but it is that way.
Yeah.
You know, I mean. You know, it's not either or, it's both and in every instance. It's only, you know, it was a very useful philosophical and scientific tool that made it, you know, that made possible a great deal of wonderful development.
Yeah.
But, you know, the either or view strikes me as being completely unhelpful now for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount happening in for example, the African creation of content.
Right.
You know, it's part of the whole move around self-representation and so on and so forth. But it doesn't seem to, it's difficult to say that the fact that Africans now self-represent doesn't mean that Westerners are interested in that. They still want to do their own representation of Africa, and, you know, and the two things exist side by side on the web, apparently not in reference to each other.
I mean,
just as they did in the other examples you were giving of, you know, you know, are we having a useful debate about God on the web?
I mean, it's better not to even admit the argument in a way. Yeah. I mean, there's an advanced magazine in this town that I used to write for a lot. That the editor came to me at one point and said, "Why don't you start writing for us again?" And I said, "Well, I don't know enough about men's shoes, I don't think." But, and he said, "Well, no. I mean, you know, thoughtful stuff." And I said, I said, "Well, all right, maybe." He said, "Well, what would you like to write about?" And I said, "I'd like to write about the information revolution in Brazil, because it didn't happen."
Yeah.
You know, and actually, a whole cultural thing didn't happen because of the government, and then. And then the information revolution didn't happen, and now it's happening.
Yeah.
You know, after it's happened other places.
Right.
I think this is interesting. I said.
Yeah.
Because it's happening in a Brazilian way, which is different. And
I don't know if you've been following what Gil Gilberto has been doing.
He's one of my closest friends.
Yeah.
So,
so it's really.
Yeah. I mean, we do a lot.
That's what you're talking about.
We do a lot together, but.
And
I was thinking about Gilles. You know, I mean, and I wanted to write about Gilles, and he looked at me and he said, "Nothing really interesting ever happens in the Southern Hemisphere." And I said, "What?" I mean, the origin of the human species, I think. He said, "But since then." Honestly. I said, "Oh, okay. Well, it's a red line zone, you know."
Yeah.
But he meant that.
Yeah, well, this is where, in the long term, we all look very foolish, don't we? I mean, there was a...
Well, actually, in the short term, he looked very foolish because he then came back and wanted me to help him get Gilberto Gil to a conference.
One of the scholars of medieval Islam said that for many generations, Arab scholars debated why Europeans were so dull, and one of them said, you know, it's not because of their genetics, because when we enslave them, bring them here, they perform quite well. It's probably the climate. In that climate, it's just not possible to think quickly. It's too cold. And this was, you know, these debates. You know, you can imagine all of the.
But that, you know, and that's what, you know. Ultimately, cyberspace is one of those great clouds of that kind of sloshing cultural interaction, you know, and hybridization. And sometimes it's working. You know, I had an inspiring experience last night. Do you know who Manu Chao is?
Yes. Great fun.
Manu Chao played at the Warfield last night, which is sort of surprising because he's a big deal and Warfield's a small place. And what I saw in this audience, which was, you know, completely heterogeneous in every conceivable dimension, was an auto-assimilation in all directions. It was the first time I'd been in a big audience where there were white people in San Francisco where I could get eye contact and not see them flinch. You know, I mean, it was incredibly heartwarming, and you know, it just everybody was speaking about 10 languages and understanding one another.
Yeah.
So I mean, that can happen, I think, in the broad, and it seems like some of what you guys are doing with, you know, art and culture.
Yeah, I mean, he is an example of creating this incredibly comfortable space where every kind of expression can just flow together.
Yeah.
I was expecting to see more of that in the web than we see. Well, why? What is it? He doesn't.
You know, and I actually had a conversation with him about this. I said, you know, I think part of your secret is that you know that most anger is actually masked sorrow. And he said, yes, but we must not let everybody know that. And I said, but you don't have an angry message. You don't incite.
Yeah.
You don't incite immune response.
Yeah, he has a transformative, he leaps.
And what we really need to do is do a huge amount of immunosuppressive stuff on our own cultures and our own hearts and on our own selves all the time.
Yeah.
Which means partly understanding immune response.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to know, first of all, you have to know who you are before you can properly not fear the other.
So what is the relationship between creativity and immune response?
Well, that's, you know, I think it's one of the deepest questions there is, because I think what most creative acts do is probe right into this, into the interstitial surfaces of that immune response. I mean, I like art that scares the shit out of me, frankly. And
it bounces if it does, the opposite direction.
You know, it's rearranging my mental furniture in ways that I have an immune reaction to.
Yeah. Yeah, it bounces in a different direction.
Right.
And that's, you know, that's obviously what we need to do, because we are, you know, we're caught in feedback loops that are not. We're not learning. It seems like,
I mean, to the extent that I understand what your foundation is up to, you know. Which seems very positive. Maybe I mischaracterize this, but it seems a very positive way of starting out with the art and then trying to preserve and, you know, strengthen that which comes around it.
Yeah, we try to enable creativity to be a resource for short and long-term processes of actually learning and actually, you know, in a transformative way in societies, and particularly, you know, we so much of the attention to issues of diversity has been a notion of heritage, where we came from.
Yeah, but which is static.
And then, you know, then we get obviously a lot of romanticizing about, you know, if you
right. I mean, and preserving this.
Preserving it in its little box.
In its box.
And you don't want anyone climbing out of their box that you put them in and all the rest of it. But a completely different approach thinks about diversity, thinks about evolutionary processes as processes of creativity and change, and we can look forward, actually, at what it would take to create a diversity that actually works.
Well, yeah, and a hybridization. I mean, I used to be in the cattle business, and let me tell you, you know, there is such a thing as hybrid vigor.
Yeah.
And, you know, you can, it applies as equally to culture as it does to genomic behavior.
Yeah. Well, we work with societies that are so-called traditional, indigenous, backward, whatever. But what we find in all of those societies is a tremendous amount of interest in
the new.
Yeah. But people want to do it on their own terms. Yeah, they don't want to do it in a way which leaves them anchorless and under somebody else's control. But they want to experiment with the new, and they find the most incredible and hilarious ways of experimenting with the new.
I have some friends, and I want to put you together with these folks. There's some friends of mine in London called the October Gallery that do what they call trans-Vanguardian art, which they go to relatively
trans-Vanguardian art. Okay.
They go to relatively traditional cultures like Papua New Guinea, and they find these sort of young, crazy people that are, you know, like doing cartoon strips with satellite characters in Papua, you know, pidgin, and, you know, as art. I mean, really kind of very advanced, edgy, contemporary Papua New Guinean art, and that sort of thing is, you know, much more interesting to me than, you know, going out there and making certain that this particular war club is perfectly preserved.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's long been a movement among artists in societies like Papua New Guinea. Someone characterized this as the authentic versus eccentric. That the outside wanted them to be authentic, and they were trying to be eccentric in their own cultures.
But that's sort of how immune response. I mean, part of immune response is good because it, you know, within the self, you know, it's self versus other, but there's also the part of immune response that regulates the self towards self, so it doesn't just. I mean, the homeobox. I mean, on the most rudimentary level, if you know, if the gene didn't rewrite itself more or less accurately, it'd be kind of Katie bar the door right away, and you wouldn't get very far. But I mean, this is also true with art. I mean, you've got to have some core that goes on being itself.
Yeah. But if it is identical, it's not art. You know?
Right, exactly. And you want to know how to, I mean, I'm sure you think about this a lot, and I do too, because we're both dealing with boundaryless conditions of future creativity.
Yeah.
How you can maintain a core of identity that is fundamentally unthreatened, and at the same time have a really active, rich miscegenation going on the fringe. And I don't think, you know, I don't think we've even started to try to figure out how to talk about this properly because we're so reactive.
Yeah. Well, identity, I mean, identity obviously has always been connected with issues of politics and so on and so forth. That's probably stronger than ever. Most of the artists who are in this genre are trying to play with identity, of course.
Trying to fail.
To play with it.
Oh, play, okay.
Yeah, and you know, but yes, trying to fail the identity test at the same time.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But this is me, this is us, it's okay.
Right.
We can, they are doing it as individuals, but yet you can also see that their whole society is engaged in this debate. And part of the identity question, obviously, comes back to issues of place and livelihood, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And
I mean, this is one of the problems with cyberspace is that that kind of doesn't matter like it does in a small town, whether it's in Africa or Wyoming.
Yeah. Yeah, you can be almost anything in cyberspace, but if you are living in the mountains of Central Asia, you know,
counts.
You were, for the longest time, you became a Soviet citizen, and you were. I mean, part of that idea was that, you know, man and his systems were going to dominate nature, and so you didn't have to go up and down the mountain with the seasons because you were a Soviet citizen, and you could get your subsidies from other places and all the rest of it. But now you're no longer part of the Soviet Union. You can have debate all kinds of things about identity, but you better go up and down the mountain because actually that's the situation. So you've got to build a culture that enables you to go back up and down the mountain at the same time as you have infinite flexibility and possibility about sort of thinking of yourself as a Eurasian. And replaying the symbols.
And not being too irritable about it if you can possibly do it. I mean,
yeah.
Or irritating. It's I mean, I guess it's just life among the humans in some respects. But it's, it was bad enough when it was village politics, and now that we have like 6.7 billion of us arguing, it's a mess.
Yeah. What are we going to do about politics?
Well, one of the things I thought would happen, as I say, I thought that, the existing structure of, the machine notion of organizing human affairs was going to collapse. What I wasn't really considering would be that we'd have to go through the current period where all of those structures would still be intact in a way, but fibrillating. Yeah. Quivering and like all fibrillating organs, consuming huge amounts of energy and resources, and not actually putting much out, and incapable of doing so, in fact. And we don't have yet started in any kind of useful way. I mean, I don't think Burning Man is the model by which we want to replace the federal government, unlike some people. But, we have not figured out how to take the self-organizing properties of the internet and start to use it to organize ourselves in a political fashion without participating too much in something that, is actually in many ways a moribund conversation that we need to engage with, but we need to figure out ways to disengage with. It's not a very clear answer, but I mean, this is an ugly phase.
Yeah, and it's not. We are not the only people looking for the answers to this. I mean, I've been very struck by how successfully, pretty nasty, groups with pretty nasty political ends use the internet to mobilize.
Oh, absolutely.
Very troublesome forces.
It's a demagogue's paradise.
Yeah. I
mean, you can. It is an absolutely brilliant place for spouting inflammatory nonsense. We knew that up front, but we just thought it would be more self-corrective, I think.
I mean, if we go back to the massacres in the Great Lakes region in the previous decade, the radio was a mobilizer. But we work in Kyrgyz Republic, and there the internet was a very, very powerful tool and deliberately used tool to construct fearful rhetorics and to document things that often didn't happen in ways to mobilize Uzbek and Kyrgyz communities against each other. So,
well, I mean, it's a poor workman who blames his tools. I mean, we will, the internet is not even a tool. It's just an environment in which we might speak, and we're still responsible for what we say. And
it's a space for this limited creature, the human being.
Yeah, and we are marvelous but flawed. It's a good thing I like the human comedy, because there's been plenty of it to appreciate.
Yeah.
Anyway,
thank you.
Thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you, John.